On the dynamics of moral posturing. In the observation of those signalling their virtue on issues of political correctness, a passing acquaintance with history may sometimes be embarrassing. It is assumed by many that humans can, of their own volition, discern what is moral, and that those who do not conform to their modern social norms are to be condemned. There are now instances of people being set upon with verbal abuse because they hold, for instance, that homosexuality is a perversion, that gender is not interchangeable, or that the climate is not really at risk. Those composing the accusatory mob don't exhibit embarrassment at their finger-pointing and shouting. They are, however, as much the slaves of fashion as those poor savages who used to push bones through their noses and exhibit hostility at those who didn't. When civilization began in about 7000 BC, in an effort to attain justice, laws were established. How can we have the justice in which others have to fulfill their bargains? They made laws with penalties and have imposed restitution. If one could not fully make good on one's obligations, one was to do so to the fullest extent possible, that is, one was pressed into slavery, and this was the nature of justice. If a government were now to advocate the reintroduction of slavery, there would be a mass uprising against it. Indeed, and I would join it. Who could possibly remain silent? Who indeed? The whole human race could, and it did so for a full 7,000 years. There are millions of cuneiform tablets from Mesopotamia, lots of hieroglyphics in Egypt, and writings from ancient Greece, Rome, and elsewhere. What is conspicuously absent from all BC writings is a single statement of conscience against chattel slavery. Aristotle said he thought some had been enslaved unjustly, but slavery itself was not condemned. Spartacus and his supporters sought to escape slavery, mainly by leaving the Italian peninsula. There is no historic evidence that they opposed the institution of slavery as such. They opposed only its imposition upon themselves. The application of slavery was sometimes opposed, but never the institution. We all now indignantly assert that slavery is not okay. We're most adamant and insistent about it, but for 7,000 years this idea never occurred to anybody at all. A proud record of moral rectitude indeed. Of course, each of us would have been the exception, I'm sure. So where is the first statement ever to be found against the system of slavery? St. Paul sent a slave, one Onesimus, who had come from his friend Philemon, back to him. Onesimus was by this time a Christian, and in his letter, the Epistle to Philemon in the New Testament, he stated that you might receive him forever, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, a beloved brother. As one commentator identified only as Bruce on the site EnduringWord.com says, what the letter to Philemon does is to bring the institution into an atmosphere where it could only wilt and die. Where master and slave were united in affection as brothers in Christ, formal emancipation would be but a matter of expediency, the legal confirmation of their new relationship. Whoever he was, he got it right. The credit for undoing the institution of slavery in time is not wholly St. Paul's, as he was heavily influenced by another. The point here is that while many may vehemently exclaim against some popularly identified evil and receive due kudos for it, much more far-reaching injustices may exist that not one person in 1,000 recognizes. Is this possible in the modern world? I, at least, think it a proven certainty. What accrued to the slave owner was not so much the slave's labor, but the profit derived from the slave's labor. A slave required maintenance, and with aging he depreciated. The wage eliminated maintenance, avoided administering maintenance, and also ended depreciation. In its primitive form, capitalism then sought, by hiring labor, to attain an unearned increment, and this pretty much in the Marxist model. There was, however, an elephant in the room that Marx would never acknowledge. It is both too subtle for many and far too large to be noticed. Darwin promulgated the survival of the fittest, but of what does fitness consist? It is incumbent upon all organisms to be profitable. Most organisms have no sense of financial profit, of course, but they have an absolute preoccupation with real economic profitability. If, in the effort of obtaining and consuming a coconut, one does not acquire sufficient energy to acquire another when required, life itself cannot be maintained. It is imperative that the human organism be profitable, and in the very nature of things, the continuing existence of humans testifies to their profitability in a real economic sense. That the human economy is profitable, that is, that our production exceeds the consumption of labour and resources in producing it, is simply unarguable, although in what are now exceptional circumstances, famine and want can exist in difficult times and circumstances. In all advanced economies, human profitability is a given. So what now becomes of the profitability of us former slaves? Firstly, we may look at the magnitude of modern human economic profitability. For all the economic statistics annually produced, human profitability has only ever been measured once. This was done for the United States for the year 2014. It may be examined at www.socialcredit.com.au. The account showed that the total incomes paid to all Americans to produce was $10.1 trillion. The total consumer products both produced and sold was $12.5 trillion. So what happened to this obvious profit of $2.4 trillion? This profit of $2.4 trillion, which amounts to $7,500 per American and to $30,000 per family of four, was distributed. If it were not, 20% of consumer products would have remained on the shelves and the economy would have fallen into immediate recession. So how was it distributed in our post-slavery economy? Total American debt was increased that year by $2.3 trillion. How was this debt increased, and to whom is it owed? All modern money is created in our banking systems by making new loans. When a bank makes a loan, nobody's deposit is reduced to loan it to another. The money supply and total debt is increased by the sum of these new loans. While this is well understood and accepted, I will give just one quote to explain it. The Bank of England's first quarterly review of 2014 states, "Whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money." It also states, "Bank lending creates deposits." Clearly, this $2.3 trillion of extra debt was created by the banks, it is owned by the banks, and they hold it as assets in the form of loans. The slave masters once owned the profit from the slaves' labours. Now, the whole profit of modern economies is owned by our banking systems, who demand its return with an increase in the form of interest payable. While this has been well understood in small circles of people for at least 100 years, public understanding is still at a similar stage to the understanding of chattel slavery in about the year AD 400. So how can we change it? The suggestion is that each nation establish a national credit authority, which would calculate the national profit in a similar way to the national dividend mentioned before. They would be empowered to issue money to this amount against a national balance sheet and distribute it, debt and repayment free, to all as a national dividend, with all receiving an equal share. This does not put more money into circulation than is now the case, but it creates and distributes the people's profit in a different way. Indignant moralizers have a big job ahead of them.